Hey y'all, my name is Matthew O'Connell. I'm currently in Dr. Spaulding's EDST 750 course. I'm currently seeking my master's in secondary education with initial licensure. My concentration is in business and I plan to teach personal finance at the high school level after graduation. So the state standard that I used for this lesson was Personal Finance Tennessee State Standard 17, which basically encompasses the notion of saving, investing, and building wealth. One particular aspect of this that I decided to focus on for this lesson was the notion of compound interest. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So the central focus for this lesson was what is compound interest and how does it apply to everyday citizens' lives. The state standards is below that, and the objectives for this lesson was for students to be able to demonstrate understanding of the compound interest equation and to determine the future value of an investment with compound interest. So knowledge of the students. So basically, some prerequisite skills that were needed were basic math skills such as addition and subtraction, as well as multiplication and division. Knowledge of percentages was also required, and the basic knowledge of interest and interest rates, and also the ability to read. Some of the personal, cultural, and community assets that I used was using those, basic math skills, the knowledge of percentages, and literary skills in order to aid them in determining the correct answer for this equation. Basically, there is direct math going on during this lesson, in which students will have to plug in numbers and solve for the equation. So I utilized the basic math skills with that. Some of the cultural and community assets that I used were things such as banks and credit unions to serve as environments where students can practically apply their learning. So whether that be going with the parent to go to the bank to open a bank account, or asking their parents about the various investments accounts that they have, or just saving money and calculating how much interest they would use or they would have at the end of a certain period of time. I really wanted to have the students relate back to their real world applications, and that would be the best form within a bank or a credit union. So that was my personal, cultural, and community assets. And now we will jump straight into the lesson considerations. So the lesson considerations that I used included grouping strategies. So I plan to divide students into pairs based on their academic ability in the subject area. So as the lesson is quantitative, I wanted to have students that were paired together with similar basic math skills in order to help and learn from each other. I also plan to monitor the classroom as I went by, and if anything, give assistance to the students, and if any further problems arose, either make a decision to let the students work independently or repair the groups. Some of the modifications I used for this lesson, or the only modification I used, was to do a simple review of simple interest and not focus so much on compound interest if a student required that. The accommodations that I used were if students could not complete 100% of the in-class assignments, they would be required to complete 50% of that. If they had a learning difficulty or had trouble reading, or did not understand the lesson completely. So some of the materials used in this lesson for me was a projector, a laptop, pen and paper. For the student, it was a notebook, pen and pencil, or laptop if needed. At the beginning of the lesson, I planned to present a PowerPoint presentation in which we reviewed the overall concept of interest. We touched on the review of simple interest and then jumped straight into the notion of compound interest and how it is different from simple interest. I provided some examples for the students and then paired them up, and you'll see that in the next slide. So during the lesson, and going through giving examples of the compound interest equation and how to solve for those using those 3 steps of identifying the elements, plugging the elements into the equation and solving for the equation. So once that was understood, I would pair the students together and they would work on their own 2 examples together. And then students would proceed to the computer where they would complete a 20-question worksheet independently. Once that was all done, after the monitoring was done and the independent work was done, then students would have returned to their seats in order to close out the lesson. So after students had returned to seats, I would restate the purpose of the lesson, the central question that we're trying to focus on, and how compound interest differs from simple interest. And then the students would demonstrate understanding of the whole lessons themselves by working independently on an exit ticket assessment, in which they would be required to answer 10 questions that involve compound interest and the compound interest equation. Students would also be asked questions in order to compare and contrast between simple and compound interest. So the extension activity would be a choice board activity, basically a tic-tac-toe board in which students would have to complete 3 compound interest equation questions, which would vary in difficulty whether they chose to go down vertically, diagonally, or horizontally. So evidence of student learning, the formative assessments that I used was to provide examples during the PowerPoint, monitor students during the PowerPoint, and expect a 50% mastery of the questions that I was asking them. So as we went through the examples, I would ask the students to help me identify the elements and then help plug in the numbers into the equation. So I required a 50% mastery on that. I was provide feedback by correcting them if they answered incorrectly, give them feedback to support the correct answer, and then leading them to that correct answer. The modifications and accommodations that I used would be for students to write down their answers instead of verbally communicating them, and then also requiring students to achieve a 40% mastery. Evidence of student understanding would be to give me the correct answers in order to solve the exam. For the summative assessment, this would be the exit ticket assessment that would conclude the lesson. I required a 75% mastery of this since it is at the conclusion of the lesson. Any modifications, I would require students to either take home the exit ticket if they cannot finish it, or complete 50% of the questions instead of 100%. Evidence of students' understanding would be, that 75% correct questions on that exit ticket. Some of the language function was analysis. A learning task was to provide questions around compound interest, and language demands with vocabulary such as principal, interest rate, and compound interest itself. As you can see, there's some vocabulary down there. The discourse including constructing an argument, interpreting graphic representations. Syntax included mathematical equations and conditional sentences. And the language reports is the keyword slide that was present within the PowerPoint presentation. These are some of my sources, and the research and theory addressed was the cognitive learning theory. Just for the final 2 elements of this presentation, I thought I would include the think sheet. So here are the example questions for the think sheet, and here is the rubric for the assignment. The 3 categories were group work with a partner, individual work on the computer, and the exit ticket assessment.